Before smartphones and caller ID, a stranger could call your home and say just enough to keep you on the line. The Sudbrink family stayed on the line, and what they heard is still unexplained 30 years later. Welcome to Battleground Times. Stay right here, because the Sudbrink phone calls of 1993 are one of the strangest cases in the entire record of unexplained phenomena. Not because of what the voice said, though what it said is deeply unsettling, but because of everything that surrounded the calls. The helicopter, the men at the airport, the doppelganger, the impersonation, the specific knowledge the voice seemed to have about a man whose movements nobody was supposed to know. This case does not fit neatly into any single category. It is not purely a UFO story. It is not purely a government surveillance story. It is not purely a paranormal encounter. It is all three of those things pressing against each other simultaneously and refusing to separate. If you are new here, hit subscribe right now. This is exactly the kind of case we exist to cover. To understand why these calls are so disturbing, you first need to understand the world they arrived in. In 1993, there was no caller ID on most home phones, no instant reverse lookup, no way to record a call unless you had an answering machine running and the presence of mind to let it run. When a stranger called your home and said something strange, your options were limited. You could hang up. You could ask questions. You could stand in your kitchen or your living room holding a receiver and feel the specific vulnerability of not knowing who was on the other end, or what they wanted, or how they knew what they seemed to know about you. The Sudbrink family had an answering machine. That single fact is the reason this case exists as anything more than a private memory. The voice was recorded. And more than 30 years later, you can still hear it. But before the calls, there was something else. Something that at the time seemed like a minor confusion and would only take on its full significance later. The year was 1992. Gary Sudbrink was an Air Force captain stationed at a base in San Antonio, Texas. He had flown back to Long Island for his brother Stephen's wedding. It was a good day. Family he hadn't seen in a long time. Friends catching up across tables. The ordinary warmth of a celebration that pulls people back to a place they came from. Late in the reception, Stephen found Gary and pulled him aside. Not in a confrontational way, more in the puzzled way of someone who needs to clear something up. He told Gary that earlier that morning, while driving out to Long Island for the ceremony, he had seen Gary's car come up behind him on the road. He described how the car pulled level with his, how the driver, who he was certain was Gary, made odd faces and gestures at him through the window, then accelerated away down the road ahead of him, apparently racing to get to the venue first. Gary listened to all of this, and then told his brother quietly that he had flown into New York, that his car was currently parked in his garage in San Antonio, Texas, that there was no way it could have been on that road. The two brothers looked at each other. Then the wedding reception continued around them, and the moment passed. Stephen filled it away as a confusion. Gary filed it away as something he could not explain. Neither of them had any framework yet for what it might mean. They did not know that the framework was coming. 1 year later, through a telephone receiver in their family home on Long Island, in February 1993, Gary had several consecutive days off coming up. He decided to use them to fly home to see his family. He had not been back since the wedding. He booked the flight quietly. Standard procedure at his base required military personnel to inform superiors when traveling, but he was confident 3 days would go unnoticed. He told nobody in New York he was coming. He told nobody at the base he was going. As far as the official record was concerned, Those 3 days were simply days off. His movements were entirely his own private business. What happened in the hours before he even boarded the plane suggested that someone had not received that memo. He was alone in his San Antonio apartment, packing his bag, when a sound outside pulled him to the balcony. He knew the sound immediately. He was Air Force. He had been around helicopters his entire adult life. He knew what they sounded like at every altitude and speed. What he was hearing was wrong. Too close. Too low. He stepped outside and looked over the fence line. A helicopter was hovering approximately 20 feet off the ground, just beyond his property. No markings, no insignia, no registration numbers, not passing through, facing his building. Specifically and deliberately facing his building. He went inside to get his binoculars. By the time he came back, it was gone. Gary landed in New York, already unsettled. 2 strange men in the space of a single airport. One with a notebook who made a beeline directly for him, and nobody else. One on the plane who moved seats twice and kept asking questions about his return date, even after he had been told to sit down. Both men specifically interested in Gary. Both men asking variations of the same question. How long are you staying? When are you going back to Texas? Gary was a military officer. He was trained to assess threats. He was trained to maintain composure under pressure. He did both on that plane, but by the time he landed in New York, he had reached a conclusion. Someone might be planning to rob his apartment while he was away. He called his landlady the moment he touched down and asked her to watch the property. Then he drove to his family home. He told his father about the strange day, the helicopter that morning, the man with the notebook, the man on the plane. His father listened carefully. Then his father told him something that changed the weight of everything Gary had just described. A helicopter had been hovering over their family home that afternoon. The same profile, unmarked, too low, stationary, and specifically oriented toward the house rather than passing through. On the same day that an unmarked helicopter had hovered outside Gary's apartment, in Texas, a second unmarked helicopter had appeared above his family home in New York. 2 helicopters, 2 states, 1 day. No explanation. Then his father told him about West Virginia several weeks earlier. Gary's father and his uncle had driven to West Virginia to visit the Green Bank Observatory. The observatory had recently installed a massive new telescope, replacing one that had mysteriously collapsed in 1988. The collapse had been officially attributed to a structural failure, but UFO researchers had been drawn to the site ever since, claiming that the damage looked more like an attack than a structural fault. Gary's father and uncle were, by all accounts of those who knew them, dedicated UFO enthusiasts. They made the trip specifically because of the site's reputation. During their visit, they had a sighting. Gary's father described it with the certainty of a man who had no doubt about what he had seen. Gary, by his own later account, did not share his father's belief system at that point. He heard the story. He noted it. He did not dismiss it unkindly, but he did not believe it. As far as he was concerned, his father had misidentified something in the sky over West Virginia and come home with a story that meant a great deal to him, but had a mundane explanation he had not yet found. Gary filed his father's sighting in the same mental folder as his brother's story from the wedding. Unexplained. Probably explainable? Not worth dwelling on. That evening, Gary called his friend Mike. They had not spoken in a while. Just a casual catch-up call. But the moment Mike answered, something was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not in a way Gary could immediately name. Just the specific quality of a conversation that has already been interrupted before it begins. The first thing Mike said was that Gary was sounding better. Gary had no idea what that meant. Mike explained. They had spoken on the phone approximately 20 minutes earlier. Gary had sounded like he had a cold. They had caught up briefly. Mike had assumed Gary was calling again to continue the conversation. Gary had not called Mike. He had not called anyone in New York. Not a single person had been told he was coming. But 20 minutes earlier, someone, with Gary's voice, had called his friend and had a conversation about his trip. The impersonator had gotten certain details wrong, including the airport where Gary had landed, which meant the impersonator had access to some information, but not all of it. They knew Gary was traveling. They did not know every detail. As Gary was processing this with Mike, the call waiting beeped. He told Mike he would call back. He switched lines, and the voice on the other end was unlike anything he had encountered before. It asked for Gary Sudbrink, slightly stuttering on the surname. Then it asked how long he would be back from Texas. Then it said something that locked Gary in place. "You are being impersonated by the other voice." Gary's first instinct was that his brother Stephen was pranking him. The voice was strange, but it was a telephone in 1993. Distortion happened. He tested that theory out loud. He pushed back. He got increasingly annoyed the way you get annoyed at someone you know is winding you up. But the voice did not break. It did not laugh. It did not come clean. It continued with its limited and repetitive repertoire. The question about Texas. The statement about impersonation. Nothing else. Then the line went dead. Gary stood in his family's living room holding the receiver. His friend had just told him someone had impersonated him 20 minutes ago, and an unidentified voice had just called to inform him he was being impersonated by another voice. Whatever was happening, it was not over. The second call came 40 minutes later. 40 minutes. The family had not even fully processed the first call. They were still discussing it. Still arguing about whether Stephen was somehow responsible. Still replaying the phrasing in their heads. The question about Texas. The information about impersonation. The way the voice had repeated itself in a loop, rather than responding naturally to what was said to it. Then the phone rang again. This time the voice was different. Not dramatically different, but different enough to notice. Slower, more fragmented, as though the words were being assembled individually rather than drawn from a continuous thought. It asked variations of the same opening question. It confirmed it was speaking to Gary Sudbrink with the same slight stutter on the surname. Then it changed direction. "Keep an eye on the sky." It said it several times. In between the repetitions of the Texas question and the confirming of Gary's name. "Keep an eye on the sky." And then something new. "Near Orion tonight, with the full moon." Gary's father straightened up when he heard this, because Orion and a full moon placed together meant something specific to him. He had been tracking the sky since his sighting in West Virginia. He had been paying attention to star positions and lunar cycles in the way that people who have seen something unexplained sometimes begin paying obsessive attention to the sky afterward. Orion. The full moon. These were not random words to him. They felt like a reference, a confirmation, something acknowledging what he had seen. Then the voice said something else, something that had not appeared in the first call. "Show double of you." The line went dead. Nobody in that room had a satisfying interpretation of those 4 words. "Show double of you." Gary turned them over. His father turned them over. The impersonation that Mike had described. The doppelganger his brother had seen on the road a year ago driving Gary's car in New York while Gary's car sat in Texas. The voice on the first call saying you are being impersonated by the other voice. And now show double of you. Something was being communicated about a copy, about a second Gary, about the existence of something that presented as Gary Sudbrink and was not. The third call came late that night at 11:38. By this point, Gary's father had moved to the second telephone in the house to listen in. He had a theory, and he was not keeping it quiet. He believed the caller was extraterrestrial. He had believed it since the second call and the Orion reference. He believed the sighting in West Virginia had made his family visible to something that was now attempting to make contact. He was not afraid. He was engaged. He wanted to talk to whatever was calling. The third call ran longer than the others. Gary fielded the opening exchange as before. The voice confirmed his name with the familiar stutter. Then Gary's father broke in from the second line. He identified himself. He told the voice directly, and without hesitation, that he had had a UFO experience in West Virginia, and that he knew the caller was an intergalactic person. The voice's behavior shifted. It became more evasive. It directed its responses back toward Gary rather than engaging with the father. But new information arrived in the call regardless. The voice mentioned government interference. It said that visitations would be disrupted. It described something rising from the dark side of the morning. Then the specific phrase that closed the third call. Show double of you, again. Followed by silence. The father was now more certain than ever. The calls were connected to his sighting. The government interference the voice described matched what he understood about how official agencies responded to UFO encounters. The men in black, the unmarked helicopters, the strange men asking questions, all of it fitting together in a framework he had been developing since West Virginia. Gary remained less convinced. He was a military officer. He thought in terms of known mechanisms, pranks, surveillance operations, psychological games. But the specific knowledge the voice demonstrated about his movements that nobody should have known about, was beginning to erode his skepticism in ways he could not fully resist. The fourth and final call came the following night at 10:21. This one was different in a way that felt deliberate. The voice opened by confirming Gary's identity, as it always did. Then it said something it had not said before. We come to be within this planet, to visit the many, to be contacted as the same with you. Gary's uncle, who had witnessed the West Virginia sighting with his father, was also in the house that night. He jumped on the line. He wanted to ask questions. He wanted to engage directly with whatever this was. The moment the uncle spoke, the call changed. The voice began warning about government interference, visitations being disrupted, something about the dark side of the morning. Strange clicking sounds increased on the line. The voice began to fade, becoming quieter and more fragmented, as though a battery was running low or a signal was weakening from a great distance. The family asked more questions. The line clicked off. The Sudbrink family never received another call. The simplest explanation for the Sudbrink phone calls is a prank. Military bases run on routine, and routine creates boredom, and boredom creates pranks. In the culture of military service, elaborate practical jokes are not uncommon. Personnel have access to equipment, technical knowledge, and the organizational skills required to coordinate a sustained deception over multiple calls and multiple days. Someone who knew Gary, who knew about his father's UFO interests, who had access to a voice distortion device, could have constructed something designed to unsettle a family they found amusingly credulous. The technology available in 1993 supports part of this. The Talkboy was a popular consumer device that year. It allowed users to record and then play back audio at different speeds, producing a slowed and distorted voice. The voice on the Sudbrink tapes has been analyzed by researchers who found that when sped up by approximately 40%, it begins to sound like a normal human voice. This is consistent with talkboy distortion, but the prank theory has problems. Significant ones. First, the recordings have been analyzed, and the speed adjustment required to produce a natural sounding voice from the Sudbrink calls is considerably different from the speed adjustment that talkboy distortion produces. The distortion on the tapes is not a precise match for the device. It is similar enough to suggest a comparison, but not similar enough to confirm it. Second, and more importantly, nobody has ever come forward. Not in 1993, not in the years following, not in the decades since, not as an anonymous online confession, not through a friend of a friend. In a world where people routinely confess to lesser pranks for attention and validation, the absence of any admission from any source over 30 years is remarkable. Pranks have a natural life cycle. They are performed, they are discovered or not discovered, and eventually they are told. This one has never been told. Third, the calls themselves are only part of what happened during those 2 days. The helicopter above Gary's apartment in Texas, the man with the notebook at the airport, the man with long hair moving seats on the plane, the helicopter above the family home in New York, the impersonation call to Mike 20 minutes before the first family call. These events are not explainable by a talk boy and a willing accomplice. They require either an elaborate coordinated multi-element operation or a genuine accumulation of connected events. The government surveillance theory addresses more of the evidence. In this reading, Gary's father's UFO sighting in West Virginia triggered monitoring of the family, not because the sighting itself was significant, but because the government maintains ongoing surveillance of people reporting unexplained aerial phenomena. The 2 men at the airport were agents. Their questions about Gary's travel timeline were intelligence gathering. The helicopters were surveillance platforms. The phone calls were a psychological operation, either to gauge the family's reaction to direct contact simulation or to apply pressure that would discourage further investigation of what the father had seen. This theory fits the helicopter behavior, the airport encounters, and the phone calls' apparent interest in Gary's movements. It fits the warning about government interference in the 4th call, which a psychological operation might include as deliberate misdirection. It fits the professional quality of the men Gary encountered, who were intrusive but not overtly threatening, exactly how government personnel would operate in a soft harassment scenario, but it struggles with the specific content of the calls. Government agents conducting a psychological operation do not tell their subjects they are being impersonated by another voice. They do not reference Orion and the full moon. They do not say, "We come to be within this planet." These phrases have no utility in a surveillance or harassment context. They are too specific and too strange to be deliberate misdirection. They feel instead like communication that was not designed for the people who received it. Which is where the UFO contact theory enters. And it enters with details that are harder to dismiss than they initially appear. The UFO contact theory does not require you to believe in alien life to take it seriously. It requires only that you take the specific content of the calls seriously on its own terms, not as proof of anything, but as a set of statements that were made, that were recorded, that have never been satisfactorily explained by any of the alternative theories, and that contain specific information that should not have been available to any conventional explanation. Start with the impersonation. The voice said twice across two separate calls, "You are being impersonated by another voice and show double of you." These statements were not random. They arrived in a context where Gary had just learned from Mike that someone had called pretending to be him 20 minutes earlier. They arrived 1 year after his brother witnessed a figure that appeared to be Gary driving Gary's car on a road Gary was not on. They arrived in a pattern of encounters and communications that kept returning to the idea of a copy, a double, a second Gary. This is not a phrase a prankster generates. It is not useful to a government psychological operation. It does not serve any manipulative purpose in either of those frameworks. But in the context of reported UFO and men in black encounter cases, it appears repeatedly. Reports of doubles, of people being impersonated by non-human entities, of witnesses seeing versions of themselves or their family members in places they could not be. John Keel, who investigated the Mothman phenomenon, extensively documented similar experiences among witnesses in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the same West Virginia where Gary's father had his sighting. Phone calls with robotic or mechanical voices. Information the caller should not have. References to government interference. Warnings about surveillance. The calls fit this pattern with uncomfortable precision. The 4 words, "We come to be within this planet from the final call," are not the words of someone conducting a prank or a surveillance operation. They are the words of something attempting to describe its own situation in a language it does not fully command. Non-native, halting, missing the natural flow of English idiom. Arriving at meaning through approximation rather than fluency. The phrase is to be within this planet, not we are on this planet. To visit the many, not to visit many people. The construction is consistently wrong in the specific way that translation produces wrongness. The concepts present, but the idiomatic assembly absent. Government interference visitations to be disrupted fits the same pattern. A native English speaker conducting a psychological operation would not construct that sentence. A being attempting to render a warning in a language it learned from a distance might construct exactly that sentence. The mention of Orion and the full moon is specific in a way that random content would not be. The caller was not simply referencing space in general. It named a specific constellation and connected it to a specific lunar phase on a specific night. Gary's father understood this as a reference to his West Virginia sighting. Whether or not that interpretation is correct, the specificity itself is notable. Something new about the father's interest in UFOs. Something new enough to reference astronomical detail that would resonate with a man who had been watching the sky since an unexplained encounter in the hills of West Virginia. And then there is Gary himself. The voice was specifically for him. Gary had not witnessed any UFO. He did not believe in UFOs at the time. He had no interest in the subject beyond the mild affectionate tolerance he extended to his father's enthusiasm. Why Gary? Why not the father who had the sighting? Why not the uncle who had witnessed it with him? One possibility is that Gary's military status was relevant. An Air Force captain with access to classified channels. A briefing officer whose job involved compiling intelligence reports for Senate committees. If something was attempting to send a message about government interference and disrupted visitations, a man with Gary's specific position might have been chosen deliberately. Not as a target, but as a potential conduit. Someone who could, in theory, take information further than a civilian UFO enthusiast could. Gary never did. He did not speak publicly about the events until he attended a UFO conference more than a decade later. He has never attempted to profit from the story. He has given measured, careful accounts that neither overclaim nor dismiss. He is, by every measure available, a credible and reluctant witness, and the calls never came again. 30 years have passed since the Sudbrink family picked up that telephone and heard a voice that did not behave like any voice they had encountered before. In those 30 years, the technology for analyzing audio recordings has become extraordinary. The ability to trace the origin of telephone calls has improved beyond anything available in 1993. The Freedom of Information environment has opened files that were sealed for decades. Researchers, journalists, and amateur investigators have applied all of these tools to the Sudbrink case, and the answer remains the same. Nobody knows, not because the case lacks detail. It has more specific corroborated detail than most cases in this category. Verifiable personnel, a recording that still exists, a consistent account maintained by Gary Sudbrink across decades without contradiction or escalation, a pattern of surrounding events that have been partly corroborated by other people who were present. The DD form equivalent, in this case the answering machine tape, preserved and available. The case persists for the same reason all genuinely unexplained cases persist. Because the available explanations do not cover the available evidence. The prank theory cannot explain the surrounding events. The government surveillance theory cannot explain the call content. The UFO contact theory cannot be proven. Each explanation covers some of the evidence and fails with the rest. What the Sudbrink case adds to the broader picture of unexplained phenomena is a specific texture. The texture of an ordinary family in an ordinary house in Long Island receiving contact that should not have been possible through equipment designed for entirely ordinary conversations. The answering machine recorded it, not because anyone planned to create evidence, but because that is what answering machines did. They ran, they recorded, and what they recorded in February 1993 in the Sudbrink home has not been explained in the 30 years since. The cases it sits alongside are instructive. Sergeant Jonathan Love vanishing near White Sands. Thomas Mantell pursuing something that cost him his life. The Maguire runway encounter, the Aller Island sightings, the Orang Medan. All cases where ordinary people in ordinary circumstances encountered something that broke the rules of their environment. That left records in the forms available. That generated official responses designed to contain rather than explain. That have persisted because the people who experienced them continued to report what they experienced regardless of the social cost. Gary Sudbrink did not attend that UFO conference a decade after the calls for attention or profit. He attended because he was still carrying something he could not explain, and he had found a room full of people who took unexplained things seriously. He played the recording. The room heard what he heard, and the questions that the room could not answer are the same questions that researchers since have not been able to answer. The questions themselves are specific. Who knew Gary would be traveling from San Antonio to Long Island on that specific day? Who stationed those two men at that airport? Who flew those two helicopters? Who called Mike and impersonated Gary 20 minutes before the first family call? Who or what called 4 times and spoke in a voice that has never been satisfactorily identified? What did show double of you mean? What did we come to be within this planet mean? What government interference was being referenced? What visitations were to be disrupted? These are not vague mystical questions. They are specific questions about specific events that occurred on specific days. They have answers. Those answers exist somewhere, in someone's memory, in someone's records, in a building somewhere or a file somewhere, or a piece of technology somewhere that encoded them. The answers were created by whatever produced the events. The events produced the questions, and the questions are still there, unanswered, attached to a recording that still plays, to a man who still gives careful, measured interviews, to a case that the available frameworks cannot close. Battleground Times leaves it there, not because there is nothing more to say, but because the most honest thing to say is that the case is open. It was open in 1993. It is open now, and it will remain open until someone comes forward with information that covers the full pattern of what happened to Gary Sudbrink and his family in the winter of 1993. If that person is watching this, if there is someone out there who knows something about the Sudbrink calls, say it in the comments. Say it anonymously if you need to. Because this is exactly the kind of case where the answer might be one piece of information away. And that piece of information might be sitting in someone's memory waiting to be shared. Drop your theory in the comments right now. Was it a prank? Was it surveillance? Was it contact? We read every single comment and we will respond to every one. Share this tonight, because this is the kind of case that deserves to be heard by as many people as possible. And subscribe if you have not already, because we cover exactly this kind of case, and the next one is already coming.